One of the most common arguments you hear by people who want to justify what Israel has done in Gaza is they say that this destruction is Hamas's fault. It's Hamas's fault because Hamas has used Palestinian civilians as human shields, and therefore if Israel's bombs and bullets are killing Palestinians, it's not actually Israel's fault, it's Hamas's fault for making them human shields. If you begin to think about this argument, it falls apart very, very quickly. First of all, under international law, what human shields means is that you force civilians to co-locate with you. It doesn't mean that you simply happen to be in close vicinity to civilians. Under international law, if an armed group happens to be nearby civilians, the state or the entity that is fighting that armed group still is obligated by international law, by rules of proportionality, to take very, very serious care about the potential civilian costs of their attack against that armed group. It's not a jail-free card to say, because there's some armed fighters nearby, we can take down the entire building. That's a blatant violation of international law. And in fact, if you did apply the principle that Israel's applying to Gaza, which is to say, if there are some Hamas fighters nearby, then we can destroy the hospital, we can destroy the university, we can destroy the apartment building, then think about how that could be applied to Israel itself, right? Israel's military bases and Israel's military personnel are deeply enmeshed throughout Israeli civilian society, right? Think about how many apartment buildings there are in Israel where high-ranking Israeli generals live or soldiers live, right? Think about the fact that Israel's military headquarters, the Kiryat, is located in downtown Tel Aviv in very close proximity to schools. So if you were going to apply that logic, then someone could say, well, we're going to go after these Israeli military targets, and because Israel has chosen to embed those military targets close to civilians, we are not responsible for the Israeli civilians we kill. That's wrong. That would be fundamentally wrong. We would recognize it as wrong. And yet that's the logic that Israel and its defenders use when they destroy hospitals, schools, universities, apartment buildings in the war on Gaza. It's also worth noting that this human shields argument is not unique to Israel. You know what the Russian military said when it began its assault on Kiev? It said that the Ukrainian government was responsible because it had its military fighters in Kiev, and it was thus using the population as human shields. Sound familiar? What did the United States say when it was bombing Vietnam? By the way, the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the communists in South Vietnam, were fighting where? In tunnels, right? This is not unique to Hamas. The way Hamas is fighting as a guerrilla movement, fighting against a much more powerful military, is not really very different than the way other guerrilla movements fight. No guerrilla movement, basically, comes out of the civilian population, puts on a brightly colored uniform, goes into an open field and says, here we are. They all fight from within the civilian population. That's what the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong did during the Vietnam War. In fact, they built huge networks of tunnels, just like Hamas has done. And what did the U.S. do? The U.S. bombed them, like Israel is bombing. And what was the justification that America used to say it wasn't America's fault? That the Viet Cong were using the Vietnamese civilians as human shields, right? That the Saudis used this argument in Yemen. This is used again and again and again. And the people who make this argument to justify what Israel's doing in Gaza, I don't think would be very convinced by Saudi Arabia using that argument in Yemen, or Russia using that argument in Ukraine, or when the US used it in Vietnam. This argument is transparently a bogus argument, just deployed in order to try to justify something that under international law is fundamentally cannot be justified.